Okay, the stream should be started up now. Alright. Let's go. See if we can't find everything. I'm streaming.
The kitty's cute.
Yeah. Okay. So I will get started in a couple minutes here once it is officially 1 o'clock. Okay, so let's get started with today's lecture. I'm going to start by just going through the quiz questions and what the results are for just the broad statistics of what people answered, because they might be interesting for framing our discussions. So the first question was, if I am obeying the law, what I am doing is always morally permissible. 78% of you said that this is false, and only 22% said that it was true. That's interesting. I certainly can think of many cases where it seems like even though you're obeying the law, you might not be doing something morally permissible. An easy case of this would be the fugitive slave laws in pre-Civil War United States, where if you captured a runaway slave and gave them back to their owner, you would be following the law, you'd be obeying the law, and yet it seems what you're doing there might not be morally permissible. But you might have a different view on which that sort of case can be integrated into a reasonable moral system. Question 2, is it ever morally permissible to break the law? So the large majority of you said, it's 70% of you said, yes, it is sometimes morally permissible to break the law. And that seems like it certainly could be true, although we will see that Socrates is going to seemingly disagree with that viewpoint in the Credo, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The next largest group, 17%, said that no, it is never morally permissible to break the law. The next 9% said yes, it's morally permissible to break the law, but only publicly to make a point. And this will be something that will come up when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. And then finally, the remaining 4% said yes, it's morally permissible to break the law, but only if the government is wholly illegitimate. So imagine what was going on in the minds of these people is that for a legitimate government, they have authority, and so it wouldn't be morally permissible to break the law. But if a government is wholly illegitimate, if it's a dictatorship or has some features which makes it illegitimate, then it's permissible to break the law. So all of these are interesting and plausible views, but that's how they break down. Question 3, do you usually have a moral duty to obey the law just because it is the law? And again, here Socrates is going to be defending the yes position here, and that's what the majority of you say as well. You say, yes, you usually have a moral duty to obey the law just because it is the law. That's 52% say that. Neck and neck are the two other options. The first other option, no, you do not usually have a moral duty to obey the law just because it is the law. That's obviously just the negation of the first view. And then the interesting, nuanced in-between view, yes, you usually have a moral duty to obey the law just because it is the law, but only if you live in a democracy. So I assume the thought here is that democracies are perhaps uniquely legitimate, or perhaps their connection between the government and the citizens makes it so that in a democracy you have a duty to obey the law just because it is the law, whereas in other forms of government you wouldn't. Question 4, the final question, is it ever morally permissible to interfere with the enforcement of a law? And the largest percentage here said that 57% said yes, but only ever if you interfere non-violently. So that's interesting that many of you think that it's permissible to interfere with the enforcement of a law under some circumstances, but only if you do it non-violently. And that's sort of the kind of view that we'll see again from Martin Luther King Jr. in a letter from a Birmingham jail. The next biggest group said no, it's never morally permissible to interfere with the enforcement of a law. That was 26%. And the remaining 17% say yes, it's morally permissible to interfere with the enforcement of law, and sometimes even using violence. And we'll see some backing for that when we read about the right of revolution in John Locke. And of course, again, Socrates in Credo seems like he's going to be saying no, it's not morally permissible to interfere with the enforcement of law. So let's get to Plato. So Plato is the one writing this dialogue. Dialogue is the style of work that he's done here, and it's called that because it's just set up like sort of like a play where there's two characters and they're having a conversation. Right? So a little bit of background for this dialogue. Socrates has been convicted in Athens for various crimes, and especially corruption of the youth. And mostly this is for what he does in all the other dialogues, which is he goes around and challenges people's beliefs. He asks them to support it with reasons, and generally tries to undermine their views. He goes around and does philosophy. And for that, he is convicted of corruption of the youth, among other things, and has been sentenced to death. So Socrates does not believe the ruling to be fair or just. He argues persuasively in another dialogue called The Apology that he's innocent of any crime, and that he in fact has benefited the city of Athens through his work going around doing philosophy. And moreover, the crime is not usually one that he would face such harsh punishment for. Usually exile or banishment is what he would get, not death. There are some technical reasons that he ended up getting death, which you could read about in the other dialogues that are about his trial. But in any case, that's not necessary to know here. Crito is a friend of Socrates who's coming to help him escape from Athens, so that he can live out his life in exile rather than be put to death. So at the beginning of the dialogue, that's just the background to the dialogue. That doesn't happen none of that happens in the dialogue itself, other than Crito saying that he's a friend of Socrates and wants to help him get out. At the beginning of the real philosophical meat of the dialogue, Socrates begins by quickly rehashing an old argument that he's had with many people, really, but Crito being among them, over what's valuable, what is worthwhile to have. And for Socrates, living a good life, that is, a moral life, one of honor, he would say, is what matters. Life on its own is not valuable, according to Socrates, only a life that's lived well and lived morally. Right? So that sort of sets a baseline where he's not going to consider arguments of the kind like, well, wouldn't it be better for you to live than to die? Wouldn't it be better for you to see your children grow up than not? Those sort of arguments are not going to be persuasive to Socrates, because he thinks what matters is really just living up to the moral law, the duties that he has according to morality. Right? So he then goes on to explain his reasons for believing that he's required to stay and willingly face the punishment that the court decided to give him, even though he thinks that the court ruled wrongly in his case, and even though the punishment they've given him is greater than the usual punishment for a crime like this. So he starts by explaining that the state and the law, generally, or the laws, can only exist if their edicts are followed by individuals. If individuals go around setting aside the law, then the law is effectively abolished. Laws aren't self-enforcing, right? It takes people to actually follow them for laws to actually be in place, right? And Socrates goes on to say that he has a responsibility to uphold those laws, as he says the laws brought him into existence. And he means this pretty literally. He says that they're responsible for him being born and for him becoming who he is, for educating him. And so he argues he has to treat the laws like he would treat his father or even his master. He's duty-bound to obey their commands no matter what. If he can't persuade them that their commands are wrong, then he has to follow them, he says. Now, it's not really clear, you might be thinking at this point, that we are in fact duty-bound to obey our parents, and certainly not our slave masters if we were slaves, no matter what. Moreover, we might even expect that someone like Socrates would think that if either of these commanded us to do something immoral, we shouldn't obey them, right? If the laws command us to go out and murder lots of innocent people, it would seem like most people would say, or at least someone so concerned with morality like Socrates would say, we're not only not duty-bound to obey them, but we might even be duty-bound to not obey them. This is a little aside. It's not clear exactly what Socrates thinks on this issue, but it's just something you might have been thinking about while reading this, that it's not obvious that we ought to obey all commands of our parents or our slave masters if we had them. And certainly not if those commands commanded us to do something immoral. Now, whether or not facing the punishment that court has given you is immoral, that's harder to say. But in any case, that's an aside to be thinking about when you're reading through this. So Socrates' next argument, after he gives this argument about the laws being like a father or a master to him, points out that the laws of Athens permit anyone to leave the city, taking all their possessions with them when they come of age or any time thereafter. So Socrates is staying and becoming a citizen and participating in Athenian life, gaining the benefits of living in Athens, creates an implied agreement that you will obey the commands of the state. So even if you didn't have any duty from the state bringing you up or anything like that, just living there, he says, is a kind of implicit agreement, and freely made agreement, he says, to follow the laws, to do what the laws say, whatever that is, and to take out the punishment that they give you in cases like this. So this is a pretty classic statement of what's now known as social contract theory, right? That is the idea that the state derives its authority from the free contract of its citizens, which give it the right to impose duties and obligations on them and punishments on them in the cases where it deems fit. And though someone may not have participated directly in the writing of the laws or the framing of the Constitution or the setting up of the government, they still agree implicitly to obey them by virtue of continuing to live in the country and receiving its benefits. This would suggest that even if a law would be unjust, or its application would be unjust, as Socrates says, the court wronged him by sentencing him to death, when in fact he was innocent of any crime. He and a person in his situation is still duty-bound to take the punishment that the laws decide to give him and not try to avoid or escape it. And this is sort of the core of both the sort of social contract theory of a sort. I mean, there are different versions of it, but this is the version that Socrates is giving, and what he's arguing to Crito here. So that's sort of the outline of what's going on in this dialogue. I don't know that anyone is live with me right now, but I will wait a minute or two. If anyone has questions that they want to send along, I would be happy to answer them. But if not, then I will see you tomorrow, and I hope some more people are able to join me. But if not, of course, you always have the option to watch this later. That's perfectly fine. Alright, so I will just wait for a minute here. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.